several years ago, I pondered making a list of Canadian classics or Canadian books I love or something around that, and I realized I had barely read any Canadian books at the time. I have still not read like a vast amount of Canadian literature. There is a wellspring that I have not even tapped, but I have started over the last 3 years to read a lot more Canadian books and to make that a goal. And as July is coming forward and July marks the time of year in which we celebrate the Confederation of Canada, the first book that I'll recommend is This Place 150 Years of Canada. This was done by Indigenous artists and creators and writers, and they put together this graphic novel that is aimed at a young readers about the stories of Canadian history. And this is very much in the idea of what we call heritage moments, in which there's just like these really corny random like 1 minute second videos in which we would have like a random moment of Canadian history represented, and in that mode some of the dialogue is like very expositionist and stuff like that, but I do think that it does create a really good entry point into some of the moments of Canadian history and the ways in which Indigenous people have been erased. Another book that I think is really incredible is Seven Fallen Feathers, and this deals with the ways in which residential schools impacted in the 1960s, as well as how it continues to impact Indigenous children in Northern Ontario today. Because of not proper education and standard of living on reservations, often children have to leave their families and leave their homes in order to get education, and that continues a cycle of taking families and breaking them apart and making children who are way too young experience life in other people's homes, in unsafe environments, and all of these things. And it is a really incredible book. So I really recommend reading those books just off the top, and then I'll talk about 16 other books that I think are just really incredible and are Canadian books. Some of these are set in Canada and are very much about Canada, and some of them are just by Canadian authors. I find that a lot of Canadian authors who don't even, have things set in Canada, there's a similar culture or like way we speak and stuff like that, and just not being able to have to go through. I always felt reading American books that I should understand it because it looks so similar to our culture, and yet I constantly felt out of culture, even by like small words like sneakers or like the sophomore freshman kind of like things like that, or soda instead of pop, and like all of these things where I'm like, oh yeah, that's a joke because you don't do that. I could have talked about like a lot of books, and there's some that I like painfully took off this list, so I will definitely do this again, but for now I'll talk about some wonderful books. The first book that I'm going to talk about has another continent's name in it, but it is You're Not a Country, Africa, and this is by Pius Anasemi, and I fell in love with the book. I found it at a thrift store, I think way back in 2017 or 2018, and I started reading it, and it is still probably one of the most like underlined books that I own. I have notes everywhere. I really enjoy the way that he like informatively, while also very sassily, talks about like world issues, the ways in which we look at history, the way we look at literature, the way we look at politics. And I think that this is a really incredible book. It originally came out in 2001. One of the pieces that I really love on here is where there is a letter that he wrote in the voice of Sarah Bartman, who is a woman whose body was put on display even after death for her unusual body that was sexualized and berated. And in this letter he talks about the ways in which African women are continually left out of the conversation, even when talking about Black literature and Black identity and culture. So often that is focused so much on African American women. It talks both about how unifying an entire continent together that is the second largest in the world really oversimplifies it, but also doesn't want to divide people of African descent so harshly. Even though he was born in Nigeria, he spent most of his life living and teaching in Canada, and he talks a lot about that, and first coming to Vancouver and then coming to Carleton, and he was a professor at the University of Carleton, which is in my hometown, Ottawa, and where like so many of my friends went. Pretty much I think 90% of my graduating class went to that college. So I remember when I originally picked up this book, I was like talking to my friends being like, hey, can you meet this man? Can you like have me meet him? And then he tragically died in a plane crash while traveling for education. Also a book that, even though it is a lot about Africa, taught me a lot about Canada and the way that we look at colonization in really remarkably surprising ways. it really confronted the ideas in which I had been taught to look at Quebecois people and the struggle for French independence in Canada, and how that often mirrors the ways in which it does in other countries. Even though it is not a skin color issue, it is something that is very, very apparent in Canada and has been going on for years, and something that I grew up in the midst of and grew up to ridicule. And this book was the first book that made me really go, oh wait, why have I been taught to like undermine and to laugh at the struggle of French Canadian people in a world and in a country in which they are the minority and have to fight for basic civil rights and language rights and stuff like that. And yeah, it's a really good book. Talking about French Canadian authors, Sylvain Neuvel wrote the wonderful Themis Files, beginning with Sleeping Giants, and this begins with Rose Franklin, and she is a young girl who's biking and she falls into a pit into a hand of a giant, and 17 years later she is a scientist who is working on this weird thing that they're not sure what it is. And it is a really, really delightful book that looks at morality and questions and all of these things with a really large ensemble cast, and the narration of this audiobook is fabulous. I really loved it. It is one of the first books that I read that was like deep science fiction, and I really have loved it. Butter, Honey, Pig Bread is one of my favorite books of all time, and it is about two sisters and a mother, and it is set between Lagos, Halifax, Montreal, and France, and it has the interweaving stories of them growing up and the ways in which trauma really rifles apart the family, and how do we talk about these things when we're so far apart. Stories of Métis Women, Tales My Cookum Told Me is a collection of real life stories from cookums or grandmothers. It is such a wonderful collection. It deals with some really heavy stuff, but I couldn't help smiling. The ways in which you really just feel these families and these lives and these stories told, and it did really feel like it was talking part of our culture, part of our land, and telling the stories of what it meant to be Métis, what it meant to be Métis then versus Métis now, and the lineage of language and culture, and you know, dealing with the aftermath of residential schools. It is a really, really good book. And I love when ordinary women get to tell their stories. These aren't like professional storytellers, these aren't professional writers. And they, you know, went around and asked older women because they wanted to preserve these stories. And I really, really love that. Phantom Pains by Therese Escon is a book that I've shouted from the mountains about. If you've been here for any amount of time, you've probably had to listen to me talk about how much I love this book. And it is a collection of poetry by Therese Escon, and it takes both the Sayan mythology and blunt realism to tell the story of how she became disabled, about the able-bodied gaze, and the way it felt to be medicalized. In her early 30s, she had a rare infection, and because of this infection, she lost much of her body, including her reproductive organs. So she looks a lot at Visayan mythology and the ways in which it tells the stories of women, barren women, and women who have been given birth, and motherless women, and all of these things to tell the stories of what it felt like to have this taken away from her, and to have her mobility taken away from her, and then also how to work on the other side of that. How do you live in a world that looks at you very, very much as a disabled person first, and looks at in disgust, or looks at in questions, or looks on all these things. Though my disability is not nearly as visible as hers, I really felt a kindredship with her talking about her experiences and the experiences of the medical system and the dehumanization of that, and all of the things, along with all of these questions of how much would I want a child, or how much would I give to have what I consider normal back. And it is a really stellar poetry collection that I just wish was in the hands of more people. Milk and Honey might be one of the most laughed at and ridiculed and degraded books that I have ever met, and yet it is a book that changed my life, and a book that I have a really large kinship for. I originally read this in 2018, and I also did not give it glowing reviews at the time, and yet I talked about the feminism of it, and this poem itself really changed so much for me. You tell me I'm not like most girls, and learn to kiss me with your eyes closed. Something about that phrase, something about how I have to be unlike the women I call sisters in order to be wanted, makes me want to spit your tongue out. Like I'm supposed to be proud you picked me, as if I should be relieved you think I'm better than them. That is one of the most powerful pieces of writings and poetry I've ever read. And as I read this collection, I shortly after became hospitalized and dealt with my life upending because of my health. And I also had this beautiful collection of poetry that taught me that a 22-year-old kid from Waterloo, Ontario could also be a writer. And she's originally from Toronto, but she went to the University of Waterloo, which, you know, is the city where I live in. When I moved to Kitchener-Waterloo, she was still living here and she was just starting to publish her work. And I find that that is like one of the most encouraging and crazy things. One of the most well-known women authors of the world is someone who literally have walked the same streets as me. People really downgrade this poetry, but the fact that it is so easily available and so easily understandable really made me think that I could be a poet. And it's a book that has such a huge influence on me, and I'm really thankful for it. And I think if you've given her The Once Over, or if you've given her The Cold Soldier, I think that recognizing that she was a college student who wrote this and like says a lot of really powerful things. Is it the most epic poetry? No, but things don't have to be epic or complex to be moving and nuanced. I really hope that this is a Canadian book that goes into our canon and is recognized for what it did. Velvet Was the Night is a book by Silvia Moreno Garcia, and she might be currently one of the most well-known Canadian authors, which I think a lot of people don't know she's Canadian because she's Mexican-Canadian. And she publishes wonderful fantasy and horror books, and this is neither of them. It is largely a thriller-esque book set in 1970s Mexico, and it deals with two people whose lives could not be more different and yet are interweaving in this really, really interesting book. I've read several of her books, but this is, I think, my favorite. Gods of Jade and Shadow are also quite good as well. I think that reading this wonderful author who doesn't write about Canada but writes from Canada is a really cool thing. The Boat People is another book that is set in Nova Scotia, and it is based on a real event about a group of Sri Lankan refugees who came to Canada and came to Halifax and yet were detained for weeks upon weeks. And this is a fictionalized version. It looks at this boat from within and without and the various people who are all being affected by it, whether it is a father and son who are separated, whether it is one of the law clerks whose family is Japanese Canadian as well and who dealt with internment, and a story that she has not told her children, and yet when they are all choosing to ignore these people and dehumanizing them, she questions why she did not carry on this legacy. And other young Sri Lankan lawyers and law clerks who are working in this saying, are we fighting against or fighting for our people? It is a book that looks at Canadian atrocities and looks at Canadian citizens and the ways in which we have failed people, and we refuse to actually offer the same things that we say we represent. She of the Mountains is a book by Vivek Shaya that I think is super underrated. Some of her other works has become really widely talked about in later years, but this book is one of her early books from 2014, and it really looks at identity as well as what is identity when we're told what identity is, and how do we reckon with that, and then how do our relationships impact this as well. This is a story of a young boy who from his early ages are told that he is gay, but he's still attracted to women, so he doesn't understand why people don't believe his identity or believe anything about him. And it is him coming of age and discovering his interactions with both men and women and how he fits in that picture. It also really reckons with who he is outside of those relationships, and can he define himself out of these relationships, because he keeps on going to people to define him, and who is he when he is separated from them. Iron Widow is a book by Zhiren J. Zhao, and they are wonderful and they are incredible, and I'm sure you know who they are if you're in this corner of BookTube. And this is a fantasy book about the first Empress of China meeting mechas. And it is a wonderful science fiction book that is sarcastic and funny while also reckoning with history and the ways in which women have been treated in that history. A Town Called Solace is a book that is really close to my heart. I have a review up on my channel going over it where I think I cry a little bit too much. But I think is just a really incredible book. It is a picture of these three ordinary people in Northern Ontario during the 1970s. It is a young girl who has lost her sister. Her sister is lost and she doesn't know where she is, while her neighbor, who she has a close relationship with, is also gone. And that neighbor is an elderly woman who is in the hospital and is talking about her life, going back and talking about her husband, talking about her inability to have children and all of these things. Well, we also have this middle-aged man who is going through a divorce and who was babysat by this older woman when he was a child, and he's talking about his own experience, his childhood, his marriage, and all of these things. And it is a quiet book. It is A Town Called Solace is the title, and yet a lot of people have criticized this book for not being as outright as they would like. And I make an argument in my review that I think that that is what it has to be. The ways in which we couldn't talk about things is explored, I think, really deeply. And I think that it's sometimes profound to show the expression of mental health and the expression of all of these things without outright saying them, because that represents a lot of people who in that era and even now feel like they can't say those things. A Really Good Brown Girl was published in 1996 by Marilyn Dumont, and it has in recent years, on its 25th anniversary, begun to have a little more traction, a little more readership, and I was really excited to read this edition of it. And it looks at a young Métis woman and her poetry and her telling her story of growing up, her various things around her. It includes a letter to our first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, who is a really controversial guy who made really ugly choices in the creation of Canada and the creation of residential schools, many other really terrible legacies of Canada, and yet is celebrated as the man of our history. Ghost Forest is a very modern book that is very vignette-y. It has a collection of random vignettes about this young woman's life and her family and grief and coming of age, and it is not a book in which you get a clear understanding of the protagonist. She's an unnamed protagonist, so we only get her thoughts, her feelings, her surroundings. We get the atmosphere, we get her reflections on life and her reflections on family and all of these things, but we don't get to know her very well. And I sometimes enjoy those books and I sometimes don't, so be warned depending on how you land on this, but I do think that it's a really interesting book and it shows a lot of nuance. I'm Not a Number is a picture book based on the author's grandmother's experience in 1920 and her being in a residential school. It deals with the separation of family, the purposeful erasure of culture and language, and one of the things that I found most profound is the cutting of the hair. This is something that I knew many of my Anishinaabe friends doing well in grief, while also realizing it's something that they did a lot in residential schools. And I never really made the connection between that until this novel, which talks about the experience of how they forcibly cut off Indigenous people's hair. And this correlated with the ways in which Anishinaabe people grieved. And the ending of their culture, the ending of their life, is also represented in this. And it also has this really sad moment in which the little girl comes back and she's trying to speak her language, but it feels odd in her mouth. And it really reckons with the legacy of residential schools and the ways in which it had a profound impact in culture and on family and on all of these things. So if you want some horror, I have Bad Cree by Jessica Johns, and this is a new release that I fell in love with. I really like it. It begins with Mackenzie. She's in Vancouver, she's having dreams, and there's lots of crows and there's lots of ominous things going on, and after a while she feels like she has to return to Alberta, which is a place she left after her Cookham death, and then her twin sister has died and she did not return because she could not deal with the grief and all of the feelings related to two of the people she loved most dying in the world. And this is a very family-focused horror. It is set in rural Alberta. It's dealing with a family of primarily women. There is men in this story, but I do love the fact that it's so woman-focused, it's so family-focused. You know, we have the matriarchs, we have the aunts, we have all of the people, and I really love the story, and I really felt connected to the family, and I got really scared at parts, so I'm really excited for what Jessica Johns writes next, and I think if you like some horror, I would really recommend this. And then last, but certainly not least, I have Lesser Known Monsters of the 21st Century by Kim Fu. And this is a short story collection that came out last year that I think is really brilliant. It is terrifying and innovative and like heart-wrenching all in the same time. It has a story of a woman who is begging an AI operator to just give her one last time with her mother. It has the story about this husband and wife who keep on killing each other and reprinting themselves because that's what you can do. You have these teenage girls who grow wings, and how does that have all these things? You have some children who have this box that has some bones and dolls in it and stuff. It is a very creepy, very introspective, very technological focused story. It is not always like super sci-fi in the ways of like Black Mirror or something like that, but I feel like it deals more with like humans as the monsters of the 21st century, the ways in which we interact, because even though there's all of these technological things around them. A lot of them are rooted in the emotions of now. And I think that I'm really excited for the other books she's going to write in the future. She's written some books already. I think these are more like 18 books that are Canadian, but I really recommend these books. I hope to see you soon and have a good time reading.